First, a shout out to John Smith for recommending this case. Thanks for your patience, brother, while I put it together. Also, I want to thank my channel members for their support and belief in me. They are Shadow Wesker, Ruth, Seamus and Giselle. Also, a special shout out to Buckethead for always being so supportive of my channel, as well as the White Gormley Brickley, aka Thomas, for all his suggestions. Now on with the video. Peter Tobin was a Scottish serial killer, rapist, paedophile and sadistic domestic abuser who murdered a minimum of 3 young women between 1991 and 2006, but it's likely he killed many more and began killing earlier than is currently known. A psychopath, Tobin showed no remorse or empathy for anyone, and despite clear evidence of his guilt, never admitted his crimes and refused to give closure to the families of any of his victims. This was a man who had no redeeming qualities and was simply evil. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Peter Britton Tobin was born on the 27th of August 1946 in the town of Johnston in the west central lowlands of Scotland. The second of 8 children, Tobin began to show delinquent behaviour from a young age, with him being described as, quote, wild by one of his brothers. He showed early signs of having no regard for the welfare of others or following the rules, and was violent from a young age. By the age of 7, he was sent to a reform school which, as the name suggests, was a type of environment where these children received an education and attempts were made to reform them. In the early 1960s, Peter Tobin apparently spent time in Borstal for minor offences. As stated in a previous video, Borstals were a type of youth detention centre in the United Kingdom which existed between the early 1900s and the 1980s, and were often horrific environments, characterised by abuse both from staff and between the boys. However, in the case of Tobin, I imagine he was the abuser and used this environment to victimise others and indulge his sadistic tendencies. In August 1969, 22-year-old Tobin married 17-year-old Margaret Mountney after a brief relationship when they met at a club they both used to go to called the Barrowlands. Margaret was drawn to the suave and sophisticated man that Tobin projected, and he would treat her with days out and introduced her to his parents. However, this all changed when they moved into a flat together in East Glasgow. Behind closed doors, Tobin's mask evaporated and he subjected Margaret to horrific abuse. The marriage only lasted a year, but in this time she was repeatedly beaten and locked in the flat by her husband. Margaret was also raped at knife point by Tobin on several occasions. The most horrific incident that Margaret was subjected to began with Tobin showing annoyance about the barking of their pet puppy named Boot, which he'd bought her. Margaret later said in an interview in 2008 that she discovered Boot missing one day and went looking for him. She recounts, quote, I ran down to the yard and I said, where's Boot? And one guy said, his head's over there and his body's over there. Tobin had decapitated the puppy, apparently in order to, quote, shut it up, and, when Margaret complained, Tobin brutally beat her and then raped her whilst holding a serrated knife to her throat. He then inserted the knife inside her, causing horrific internal injuries. Blood from this act seeped through the floor and through the ceiling of the downstairs tenants, who called the police, and Margaret was taken to hospital. She spent weeks in hospital, but was too terrified of Tobin to make a complaint to the police. Tragically, the extent of her injuries was such that Tobin had robbed her of the chance of ever having children. Margaret was finally able to flee the marriage when, in 1970, Tobin was sentenced to 5 years in prison for forgery and burglary, and I've little doubt, if he had not been removed from her life, she would have been murdered. Tobin served half his sentence and was released in late 1972 or early 1973, and, within weeks, he'd met and married a 30-year-old nurse called Sylvia Jefferies in Brighton, where he relocated to. In an interview in 2008, Sylvia outlined the horror she endured at the hands of Tobin. Like his first wife, Sylvia was drawn in by the intelligent, well-spoken man that Tobin pretended to be. But, once they married, he believed that he owned her and could do whatever he wanted. The pair had a pet dog, and Tobin would abuse this animal, assaulting it and swinging it around by its collar. Sylvia would also be beaten, and she remembered being threatened by Tobin whilst he was holding a knife to her neck, shouting, quote, "I'm going to kill you." Tobin would strangle Sylvia during sex, and use of violence seemed to be the only way he could become aroused. The pair had a son and a daughter who unfortunately died during infancy, but it was clear that Tobin had no regard for his children, and Sylvia recalls Tobin being annoyed by the rocking of their son's crib, and her, due to pure terror, going over to the baby and saying, quote, please be quiet, you'll make him crosser." Sylvia knew she had to escape the marriage, and in 1976, after 3 years of hell, she was able to do so with the help of a woman's refuge. She stated, quote, "I just literally got to carry a bag with some stuff for my child and a pushchair. That's all we had. I can't explain the fear that I had. If he'd have come back, he would have killed me." Sylvia was then helped to get a permanent restraining order prohibiting Tobin from ever contacting her or their son ever again. Peter Tobin then appears to disappear for almost 10 years, with police being unable to find any real trace of his movements during this time, with them believing that he joined a motorcycle club called the Rising Sun, living a nomadic lifestyle across the country. However, there's potentially another reason for this, as Peter Tobin was a man who frequently changed names and vehicles in order to remain anonymous and move without detection. Tobin is believed to have used over 40 aliases throughout his life, stayed in over 20 different locations, used 40 different phone numbers, and used over 150 vehicles to travel from place to place and cover his tracks. Tobin next reappeared in 1984 when he was living in Portsmouth, Hampshire, during which time an 8-year-old girl reported that she'd been raped repeatedly by him over a number of months. The police were called, but Tobin was not prosecuted due to insufficient evidence. In 1986, Peter Tobin met 16-year-old Cathy Wilson in Brighton, and, within 3 weeks, she was living with him. By this point, Tobin was 40 years old, so double Cathy's age, and it's clear that he was targeting younger women, likely for 2 reasons. As I mentioned in a previous video, I believe this was to more easily be able to control his partners due to the difference in age causing an obvious power disparity in the relationship. However, secondly, I believe it's indicative of his sexual attraction to children and young women who would become his future victims. Soon after meeting Cathy, she gave birth to their son Daniel, and in August 1989 they married and moved to a house in Robertson Avenue in the town of Bathgate, West Lothian, Scotland. Within this house, Cathy was subjected to horrific abuse. In an interview in 2022, Cathy said, quote, "Throwing his dinner at me, putting his hands around my throat became routine. I was his slave. Even when I went into labour, he refused to take me to hospital until I'd cooked a roast dinner for him and some friends. I was scared to cross him and felt completely tied." Cathy also stated that Tobin would call her a, quote, "useless bitch" or, quote, "slut." He used her to live out his depraved rape fantasies and would regularly bring home prostitutes and force Cathy to watch him assault, hit, gag and strangle these women. Tobin would specifically pick emaciated small women akin to children, again demonstrating his paedophilic inclination. Tobin would also threaten to murder their son. Cathy too knew she had to leave, or she would die, as she began to hide money, and in April 1990 she'd saved enough money to flee across the border into England with Daniel, eventually moving to Portsmouth, inevitably saving her life. After this, Peter Tobin began committing the murders that had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Peter Tobin's first confirmed victim was 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton, who was last seen on the 10th of February 1991 at a bus stop in Bathgate in Scotland, waiting to return home to her family. This bus stop was less than a mile away from where Tobin was living at the time. What happened next will never be known with certainty, but the most likely scenario is that Tobin pulled up beside Vicky and offered her a lift, and, when she was in the vehicle, he drove her to his property in Robertson Avenue, forced her inside, and then attacked and killed her. Her remains were not found for almost 2 decades, so her cause of death could not be determined, but it appeared she'd been beaten, raped, and strangled to death. Tobin then hid Vicky's body, likely in an upstairs bedroom, and, when he found a new property to move to in Margate, Kent, he cut Vicky's body in half and wrapped the pieces in curtain and bin bags. On the 21st of March 1991, he drove the almost 500 miles to his new property with her remains in the car. His new address, 50 Irvine Drive, would be central to his exposure as a serial killer decades later. Soon after moving in, Tobin was seen by a neighbour digging a hole in the garden, who he told he was creating a sandpit for his son. A few days later, the neighbour saw the hole had been filled in, not realising that he was looking at the resting place of Vicky Hamilton. Just 6 months after killing Vicky Hamilton, Peter Tobin claimed his second victim, 18-year-old Dinah McNichol, an 18-year-old sixth form student from Tillingham, Essex, who was last seen alive on the 5th of August 1991. On this date, she was hitchhiking home with her boyfriend, David Tremlett, from a music festival in Liphook, Hampshire. Dinah was at the music festival as part of a summer of relaxation before taking the next step in her life. She was described as an intelligent woman, and she had recently passed 4 A-levels, but she would never know her results. Eventually, the pair were picked up by Tobin, and at junction 8 of the M25, near Reigate in Surrey, David was dropped off. He asked Dinah whether she wanted to come back to his house, but she said she just wanted to get home, so she stayed in the vehicle with Tobin, and the car drove away. She was never seen alive again. Again, Dinah's remains were not discovered for almost 2 decades, and it became apparent that she'd been drugged, gagged and bound, with her hands being found tied behind her back. She was then raped and likely strangled to death. It's unclear where Dinah was murdered, but Tobin took her body back to 50 Irvine Drive, wrapped it in bin bags, and then buried it in the garden, mere feet away from the remains of Vicky Hamilton. In 1993, Peter Tobin again relocated, this time moving to Havant in Hampshire, apparently to be close to his son Daniel, who, as I stated, had moved to Portsmouth with his mother, Cathy Wilson, who fled their marriage in 1990. Whilst Cathy wanted nothing to do with Tobin, she wanted her son to have an opportunity to know his father, and so would sometimes stay with him. However, as if to epitomise the absolute lack of regard for anyone but himself, on August the 4th, 1993, Tobin used his son to lure 2 14-year-old girls into his flat under the guise of giving them a babysitting job. Once in the flat, Tobin threatened them with a knife, bound them, forced them to take drugs which made them drowsy, and then raped both children, including one anally. He also stabbed one of the girls. This was all whilst his son Daniel, who was around 3 or 4 years old at the time, was in the property, but in a separate room. Daniel then walked in and interrupted, at which point Tobin turned on the gas in the property and took his son, giving him back to his mother, and then disappeared. By some miracle, after 5 hours of sitting in a property full of gas, one of the girls managed to loosen her bindings and escape to notify the police. A manhunt was started for Peter Tobin, who was by now going by the name Peter Wilson, and he sought solace in a religious community called the Jesus Fellowship. However, the crime and a photograph of Tobin were featured on the BBC programme Crime Watch, a show similar to America's Most Wanted in the States. The community contacted the police and Tobin was arrested. On the 18th of May 1994, at Winchester Crown Court, Tobin admitted his guilt to raping and abusing the 2 girls and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. The authorities believed they were locking up a dangerous sex offender. Little did they know, they had apprehended a man who had killed at least 2 young women and would continue to kill as soon as he was re-released. Peter Tobin was released in 2004, at age 58, and returned to Scotland, moving to the town of Paisley, close to the town where he was born. Due to the nature of his conviction, Tobin was required to check in with the police regularly, but he soon disappeared, and, in November 2005, an arrest warrant was issued when he moved out of Paisley without notifying police. However, Tobin used his skills to evade capture, and, going by the name Pat McLaughlin, he actually did not go far, moving to Glasgow, approximately 12 miles away. By September 2006, Peter Tobin was working as a church handyman at St Patrick's Church in Anderston, in the centre of Glasgow, and it was here that he met his last victim. Angelika Kluk was a Polish national and just 23 years old when she died. She was working at the church as a cleaner in order to finance her Scandinavian studies at university. She was last seen alive in the company of Peter Tobin on the 24th of September 2006. Angelica was a conscientious, polite and reliable person, and when she did not arrive for work, the police were called. An extensive search was conducted, and on the 29th of September 2006, 5 days after last being seen alive, Angelica's body was found concealed in an underground chamber beneath the floor near the confessional in the church under a tarpaulin. Angelica had been raped, viciously beaten, and stabbed 16 times, and her hands were found bound behind her back. It's believed that Angelica was still alive, although likely only for a short time, when her body was placed under the floorboards, where she bled to death. Fingerprints found at the scene showed that Pat McLaughlin was in fact Peter Tobin, who by this point had escaped to London, and a nationwide manhunt was begun. On the 1st of October 2006, Tobin went to a hospital in London due to an issue with his heart, and gave a false name, hoping this would throw anyone off his tracks. It did not work. He was recognised as being a wanted man from police alerts, and he was finally arrested. Peter Tobin gave no information to the police and appears to have been as obstructive and obnoxious as possible when dealing with authority figures. However, in the case of Angelica Kluke, the police did not need anything from him. They had overwhelming forensic evidence, and he was charged with her murder within 6 days of his arrest. Tobin pleaded not guilty to murdering and raping Angelica, but was convicted of both charges at the High Court in Edinburgh after a 6-week trial that ran between 23rd of March and the 4th of May 2007. Judge Lord Menzies described Tobin as, quote, an evil man, and stated, quote, any case of rape is serious, any case of murder is serious, but what you did to Angelica Kluke was inhuman. He then sentenced him. For the rape and murder of Angelica Kluke, Peter Tobin was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 21 years before he could apply for parole. With Peter Tobin safely behind bars, the police coordinated across areas, leading to Operation Anagram being established in 2006. The purpose of this task force was to trace Tobin's movements throughout his life in order to link him to unsolved murders or eliminate him from inquiries. It's likely the police, in conjunction with psychologists and psychiatrists, realised how dangerous Tobin was and that he had likely killed other women, but I think their concerns were galvanised when, in prison, he claimed to have killed 48 people. There is no evidence this is true, but it likely reinforced the police that they had no idea how many people Peter Tobin had actually killed. Their inquiries led them to search his former property in Robertson Avenue in the town of Bathgate. Within this property, the police found DNA evidence showing that Vicky Hamilton had been there. Police then searched 50 Irvine Drive in Margate and, acting on intelligence, began to dig up the garden. Finally, on the 14th of November 2007, police recovered the remains of Vicky Hamilton, and, 2 days later, on the 16th of November 2007, the body of Dinah McNichol was found, enabling both women to be given a decent burial almost 20 years after they'd been murdered. Peter Tobin was tried separately for the murders of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol. In both cases, Tobin, despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt, including his DNA being found on the wrappings on both bodies, pleaded not guilty and forced the offences to go to trial. With regards to Vicky, on the 2nd of December 2008, Tobin was found guilty of murder after a trial at the High Court in Dundee. The judge stated, quote, you stand convicted of the truly evil abduction and murder of a vulnerable young girl in 1991, and thereafter of attempting to defeat the ends of justice in various ways over an extended period. Yet again, you have shown yourself to be unfit to live in a decent society. It's hard for me to convey the loathing and revulsion that ordinary people will feel for what you have done. I've fixed the minimum period which you must spend in custody at 30 years. Had it been open to me, I would have made that period run consecutive to the 21-year custodial period that you're already serving. By the time of this sentence, Peter Tobin was in his 60s, so a new sentence of a minimum of 30 years was essentially confirming that he would die in prison, but this was guaranteed after the conclusion of the trial for the murder of Diana McNichol before Mr. Justice Calvert-Smith at Chelmsford Crown Court. On the 16th of December 2009, after only 15 minutes deliberation, the jury found Tobin guilty of murder. Justice Calvert-Smith then sentenced him, stating, quote, "The mandatory life sentence in this case has to be accompanied by a whole life order. Therefore, this confirmed that Peter Tobin would spend the rest of his life behind bars." Peter Tobin was sent to HMP Edinburgh and received some retribution for his crimes, including on the 1st of July 2015 when he was attacked with a razor blade whilst he was asleep, which resulted in a 20cm long scar running down his face and neck. By October 2022, Peter Tobin was in ill health, suffering from cancer, and was transferred to the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. I wouldn't normally post a picture of someone so vulnerable in the hospital, but here is an image of Tobin, chained to the bed, alone, dying. The police made one final plea to Tobin to reveal the details of other murders he committed, but he remained silent. And, on the 8th of October 2022, at the age of 76, Peter Tobin died in hospital. No one came forward to claim his body, so he was cremated and his ashes scattered at sea. The police investigated Tobin's potential connection to in excess of 15 unsolved murders and disappearances of young women and children across the UK, Ireland and Scotland. Some of these offences appear unlikely to have been committed by Tobin, but there are at least two that seem likely. The first of these is the disappearance of 18-year-old Louise Kay, who disappeared on the 24th of June 1988 when, after a night out with friends, she said that she was going to sleep in her car at Beachy Head in Eastbourne in East Sussex. This was something that she'd done before. However, Louise then disappeared, and her body and a hand-painted gold Ford Fiesta car have never been recovered. Peter Tobin was known to be working in Eastbourne at the time of the disappearance, and apparently was trying to sell a hand-painted car. It appears that researchers, police officers and psychologists believe that Peter Tobin was likely responsible for the disappearance and likely murder of Louise Kay, with them believing that he buried her body somewhere known only to him. The second case was that of the murder of 22-year-old Jessie Earl, who vanished, again in Eastbourne, sometime between the 15th and the 18th of May 1980. Her skeletonized remains were found in 1989 as she'd been bound with her own bra. Again, Tobin is believed to have been living and working a short distance away from where Jessie disappeared. Unfortunately, no firm evidence has ever been recovered to definitively identify Peter Tobin as the murderer of any other young girls or children, and, given his death, he has inevitably taken his secrets to the grave with him. Before speaking about Peter Tobin, I want to play a very short clip for you. I'll explain why in a moment. The reason why I added this clip was because I'm always fascinated what these people look like when they're actually committing their offences. I sometimes find it difficult to reconcile the outwardly calm person who appears in court and the monster their poor victims must have experienced in their last moments alive. However, sometimes they let the mask slip. Ted Bundy did this on at least one occasion, and I believe that this is Peter Tobin doing the same. You get a flash of just a fraction of the true monster that he was, a devil in human form. With regards to him, I've read that Tobin was a psychopath, but I cannot see when he was diagnosed, or whether this is even a formal diagnosis. However, I've no doubt it's true. He clearly had no remorse for any of his actions, and behind his suave and confident demeanour was a spider just waiting to draw women into his web, and when he caught them, he subjected them to horrific acts of violence, rape, and eventually murder. At the core of Tobin's behaviour, aside from no empathy for others and remorse for his behaviour, I think of two things. Firstly, a hatred of women, and secondly, sadistic sexual interests. I think the best example of this is actually his behaviour towards his partners. As I've stated in previous videos, the most common profile of domestic abuse perpetrators are those who seek to control in order to ensure they're not abandoned. However, Peter Tobin is different, and, in my opinion, represents the most dangerous type of domestic abuser, which, given how insidious and often fatal it is really saying something. What I mean by this is that it's clear that Tobin was a nomad. He seemed quite content to move around the country, uprooting his life frequently, and, from what I can see, had no real social connection or friends. So this indicates that Tobin abusing his partners was not about trying to stop a partner from leaving him. He didn't care about this. I think it was just about torturing women. The abuse that he subjects his partners to, I can only conclude came from a deep hatred of females. But where this came from and why, I can't say. It's clear that the violence used by Tobin sexually excited him, with one of his wives indicating this was the only way he could get aroused. So I've no doubt that raping women was his fixation, with their terror and cries likely heightening his sense of gratification. This man was a monster, an inhuman specimen who took so much and gave nothing during his miserable existence. I have no doubt that Peter Tobin killed far more people than we will ever know, as I find it inconceivable that a man with his proclivity to violence would suddenly start killing at the age of 44 and kill 2 women within 6 months of each other, having never done this before. I doubt, as Tobin claimed, he killed over 40 people. I think this was just a narcissistic boast from a pathetic little man, but I wouldn't be surprised if the true number, although we'll never know, is above 10. So, what are your thoughts on this case? Had you heard about the crimes of Peter Tobin before? On another note, if you want to support the channel, you can become a channel member or send a super thanks, but there's genuinely no pressure. Thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.